Hello everyone, welcome to my book channel. The 2025 Booker Prize was just announced on November 10th and it was awarded to Flesh by David Szalay. So as soon as I saw this announcement, I was very excited to check out this book and I immediately found an audiobook on Spotify and listened to it over the next few days. So now that I've finished this book, I have some very mixed feelings about it. Let's discuss. This is a coming-of-age story of István, who was 15 when the story began. He lived with his mother in a flat in Hungary, and he started this very dubious relationship with an older woman who lived across from them. And then after that, his life kind of spiraled out of control. At the very beginning of the story, he just started at a new school, and he only managed to make one friend, and immediately they start talking about sex and masturbation. I suppose this is probably like a rite of passage for boys that age. I've never been a 15-year-old boy, so I can only guess that that's somewhat representative of that phase of someone's life. And it became quite clear that they were kind of obsessed with intimacies and the opposite gender. And his friend introduced him to a girl and she ended up not being very interested. And then later on, his mother suggested that he help out this older woman who lived across from them. And he basically started helping her carry her groceries back to the flat. And one day she offered him some food and then afterwards very casually asked, "Can I kiss you?" And before he could say anything, she just kissed him anyway. And from there, this kind of very dubiously consensual relationship just started escalating. I had this impression that he was really just too shy and like too reserved and having trouble standing up for himself and saying no. And then she just kept escalating and kind of taking advantage of him. So this entire first chapter was just very uncomfortable because it kind of recounts their intimacy in a lot of detail. And the whole time you're under this impression that this young boy isn't really willing, but things just kept happening anyway. And after this went on for a while, he kind of got it into his head that he was in love with this woman, which led to a very accidental and kind of tragic confrontation with her husband. And István ended up in a juvenile correction facility. So after that, István didn't really have many options, so he ended up joining the army, and that experience led him to working as a security driver in kind of the upper class world of London, and he kind of briefly got swept into this world of wealth and luxury. So that is the premise of the story, and my impression of this novel was mostly negative, I would say throughout the vast majority of the book, and it didn't start to improve until near the end. So let me take you through my reading experience and my opinions. So as I've just mentioned, the opening chapter of the book was very, very uncomfortable because you are seeing something happening in detail to a teenager whose brain isn't fully developed, and legally he doesn't have the capacity to consent, and yet things just kept happening to him and you're just left sitting there having to kind of almost watch this happen. And the novel includes all of the details like the removal of clothing and who's touching what body part. It's kind of like you're being forced to watch something that really shouldn't happen. I guess that's one of the points that the author is trying to make, is that this kind of advantage taking happens to young people and it is awful and it is wrong and it will have traumatizing and very negative impact on a person's life going forward. But he did make the reading, or I should say listening experience of this story very, very unpleasant, and I had wanted to DNF it multiple times just within the first chapter. To be completely honest with you, if this book wasn't like an award nominee or award winner, if I just happened across it in a bookstore and opened up the first few pages, flipped through it, I would have put it back on the shelf and just not thought about it ever again. But this is only one of the things that made me have a very negative impression of this novel throughout most of it. Another thing that I wanted to talk about that I really strongly disliked was the dialogue. So for this, I will give you an example from the free Kindle sample that I found. So I will read you a small section from chapter 1, so there's no spoiler here. "This is my friend," István's friend says. "You know, the one I told you about." "Okay," the girl says. She and István look at each other for a moment. "Okay," István's friend says. "Yeah," the girl says. The three of them just stand there. The girl looks at István again. He doesn't look at her. "Okay," István's friend says. And the story goes on like this, and this is kind of the speech pattern throughout the entire novel. So this is kind of the style of the dialogue and the writing throughout the entire book. It is very sparse, very choppy, and the sentences are very short and simple. And what kind of upset me was that there's not really a distinct speech pattern of any character to speak of. Ishtaman talks like that, and a lot of other characters also talk like that. It's kind of like any two characters talking to each other is a bit like pulling teeth. There is a lot of, okay, he says, yeah, she says, no, he says. And the longer it went on, I started to feel like maybe just no one in this story really wanted to talk to each other, and no one really had anything interesting to say. And that was very upsetting for a work of fiction. And there's another issue with the writing, which is that massive gaps are left in the narrative. So you would follow the narrative for a while, and then there would be a brief pause. And then when the story picks back up, it's like 5 years later or 7 years later, and something very big had happened. And you only learn about it from the characters mentioning it in passing. So these events that you would think are kind of fundamental to developing the character or changing the world that this narrative happens in is just never mentioned in detail. And the scenes that the author chose to put in detail are filled with that kind of boring, choppy dialogue that I just told you about. At one point, I started feeling like I was watching just a badly edited movie where like the interesting scenes were cut out, and then you're watching the boring scenes during which the characters would mention, oh, this happened, which was huge. And that's it. So far we have very choppy and boring dialogue and like a very bleak and depressing story that's told in a very stilted pacing. And the characterization doesn't really save it either. So Ishtaman kind of remains this really shy and reserved, detached, and I guess kind of depressed person throughout the entire story. And you can tell that he had this tendency of self-loathing and self-destruction. So originally I had thought maybe the author was trying to write like a Dickensian protagonist and a Dickensian story where you have a poor boy from a poor family. He grew up in difficulty and awful things happened to him. And then he later met this kind of benefactor type of person that plucked him out of poverty and gave him a taste of the easy life, so to speak. Except this story doesn't have those like colorful characters or memorable dialogue that we love Dickens for. This story is just kind of a poor boy who couldn't advocate for himself, couldn't stand up for himself, and then just kind of floating through the world, being swept into the army and then later upper class society. He's very detached from everything, and you kind of feel like he doesn't really have like a proper capacity to love. So maybe you can attribute that to what happened to him early on in his life. He kind of made choices regarding his personal relationships, not out of love, but more out of opportunist concerns. So the character is just kind of trudging through the world as you, the reader, is trudging through this story. And then I did feel like there was a turning point in chapter 8. So there was this really young person who is just also like going through this coming of age, learning about sexuality and kind of coming to terms with his changing body. And Ishtavan observes that, and then he kind of reflects upon his own experience during that phase of his life, like coming of age and reflecting back on his body and his life. So that moment of self-awareness kind of turned the story around a little bit for me. And then soon after that, he made a choice that I would say changed the story from like a 1-star read to more of a 3-star read for me. So he made a pretty big decision when it really mattered for another human being's life that I think really showed his conscience, regardless of all the wrongs that had been done to him and all the wrongs that he had done personally. I think that was like a moment of goodness that was rather precious in this story. And then if you take that into account and everything that happened to him after he made a choice of goodness, the story becomes even more poignant. So I would say the ending saved this story for me. But to get to that point, to get to the point where you can like really reflect on humanity and goodness and things that are demonstrated by Ishtavan's actions and everything that happened to him later, it's quite the slog. I would say the majority of this novel was quite depressing and honestly just quite boring to read because of the way that it's written. The dialogues are very choppy and reluctant, kind of like pulling teeth, and the narrative has massive gaps in it that you later realize that the interesting thing things, the major events were skipped over. But the message of this story overall regarding the human condition, regarding like how a young person can be crushed by reality and then just end up kind of floating through the world like a piece of flesh, I guess, is what the author is trying to say. That message is poignant and it's very valuable to reflect upon, but to get there, it's definitely a labor of patience. So if you are curious about this novel, if you're interested in it, I highly recommend getting a sample from Kindle, like the one that I just read you. I think the Kindle sample contained most of chapter 1, so you can get a feel of the writing style for yourself, see if it's something that you can get through. But also, I have to warn you that chapter 1 is kind of the most uncomfortable, full of unpleasant detail part of the story. So the total length of the audiobook was 9.5 hours, and the book is about 368 pages long in print form. So if you are an efficient reader, you might not even need 9 hours to get through it. But I would still recommend that you get a sample for it, just for the simple reason that new books are so expensive these days, and it's quite devastating if you pay like $30 for a book and you end up like realizing within chapter 1 that you really don't enjoy it and rather be rid of it. Overall, I can't say I agree with the judge's choice to make Flesh the winner of the 2025 Booker Prize, and I have to say my overall experience reading the 2025 Booker selection has been mostly disappointment. I think my easy favorites are Seascraper and Audition, and the other books that I've read, Flesh was kind of a very mixed experience for me. Endling, now that I think about it, I was probably a little bit too harsh in my original review of Endling, just compared to Flesh. I think that book actually had some more interesting and meaningful themes regarding war and propaganda. Flashlight was a good story and very unique in its portrayal of East Asian politics post-World War II, but it felt very overwritten. And Universality, I absolutely loathed, and The South, I couldn't finish. So my reading experience of the 2025 Booker selection so far has been 2 for 7, and I would put Flesh in the same group as the other 5. So I'm sorry to say that this was quite a negative reading experience for me overall, although I find the ending of this novel to be poignant and meaningful. To get there, the first 75% of this book was quite the slog. And I do think it's possible to deliver the message that the author had in mind with better dialogue, better pacing, and just more engaging and more interesting writing overall. But regardless of my personal opinion, I hope you find this video enjoyable. I hope you found it helpful in helping you decide whether you want to pick up the winner of the 2025 Booker Prize. And if you've read Flesh by David Szalay, please let us know in the comments below what you thought of this book and whether you agree with the judge's choice. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.